He was Rome's second emperor, the man who inherited the greatest empire on earth from Augustus Caesar himself. He was a brilliant general who had won wars on 3 continents, a disciplined administrator who actually increased the imperial treasury, a man who by every objective measure should have been remembered as one of Rome's greatest rulers. Instead, he is remembered as something else entirely, as the emperor who retreated to a private island and ran the empire through terror from a distance, as the man under whose reign treason trials consumed the Roman Senate like fire consuming dry wood, as the emperor Caligula succeeded, and whose reign somehow made Caligula look like a relief. His name was Tiberius, and his story is the darkest in all of Roman history. Before we talk about what Tiberius became, we need to understand what he was before power consumed him. Because Tiberius Julius Caesar was not born a monster. He was not born to darkness. He was born to one of Rome's most distinguished families and grew into one of the most capable military commanders the empire ever produced. He fought campaigns in Armenia, Pannonia, Germania, and Dalmatia with a consistent competence that earned him genuine respect from the soldiers who served under him and the Senate that watched his career develop. He was serious, disciplined, intelligent, and humorless in a way that Romans who preferred the warmth of Augustus found off-putting, but that military men who valued reliability over charm found deeply reassuring. Then Augustus made decisions that changed everything about who Tiberius was. To understand Tiberius, you must understand what Augustus put him through in the name of dynastic planning. Augustus was obsessed with succession and desperate to keep the imperial line within his own blood. He had one child, a daughter named Julia, and no biological sons. His solution was to use Tiberius as a political instrument, while simultaneously making clear that Tiberius was never his first choice for anything. Augustus repeatedly passed over Tiberius in favor of other younger relatives. His grandsons Gaius and Lucius Caesar were the preferred heirs, and Tiberius was the backup plan, the fallback, the man you used when everyone you actually wanted was unavailable. The most personally devastating thing Augustus did to Tiberius was force him to divorce a wife he genuinely loved, Vipsania Agrippina, daughter of Agrippa, and marry Julia, Augustus's daughter, for purely dynastic reasons. Ancient sources record that after the divorce, Tiberius encountered Vipsania by accident in Rome and followed her through the streets with an expression of such naked grief that Augustus made sure they never crossed paths again. He was forced to give up the woman he loved for a political marriage to a woman he eventually despised and who despised him in return. Julia's behavior during the marriage, her numerous and very public affairs, became a scandal that resulted in her eventual exile by Augustus. Tiberius was publicly humiliated and privately miserable. He responded to this accumulation of personal and political humiliation by doing something that confused and alarmed Rome entirely. He retired. In 6 BC, despite being at the height of his military reputation and political influence, Tiberius simply withdrew to the island of Rhodes and refused to come back. He spent 7 years on Rhodes, living as a private citizen, studying Greek philosophy, attending lectures, and removing himself from Roman political life as completely as possible. Rome was baffled. Augustus was furious. Ancient sources describe Augustus refusing to allow Tiberius to return when he eventually requested it, keeping him on Rhodes essentially as a form of punishment for the abandonment. The most capable military commander in Rome was sitting on a Greek island reading philosophy while Augustus's preferred heirs were being prepared to replace him. Then Augustus's preferred heirs died. Lucius Caesar died in 2 AD. Gaius Caesar died in 4 AD. Augustus's careful dynastic planning had been destroyed by mortality, and he was left with the man he had always treated as a last resort. He adopted Tiberius formally in 4 AD and began preparing him seriously for succession for the first time. Tiberius returned to Rome, resumed his military career with campaigns in Germany and Pannonia, and was clearly positioned as the next emperor when Augustus died in 14 AD. He became emperor at 55 years old, a man who had spent decades being alternately used and ignored by the man whose position he was now inheriting. He had been forced to give up the woman he loved. He had been publicly humiliated by his wife's behavior. He had been passed over repeatedly in favor of younger relatives who then died. He had spent 7 years in effective exile on an island. He had been brought back and prepared for a role he had once wanted and now approached with something that ancient sources describe as genuine reluctance bordering on refusal. He repeatedly asked the Senate to share his burden, to govern collectively, to not leave everything to one man. Whether this was genuine philosophical preference for shared governance or political theater designed to make the Senate beg him to rule is something ancient sources debate, and that has never been fully resolved. His early reign was genuinely well governed. He maintained Augustus's policies with careful competence. He refused excessive honors, declining temples and divine titles that other emperors accepted eagerly. He was financially responsible, accumulating a treasury surplus that would fund Caligula's early extravagance for years. He was accessible to senators and treated them with a respect that the best of Augustus's reign had established as the appropriate relationship between emperor and senate. Ancient sources describe this early period with genuine approval. A serious, capable administrator doing the difficult, unglamorous work of running an enormous empire without the drama or cruelty that would come later. Then Sejanus entered the picture, and everything changed. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal military force that had been the decisive factor in multiple imperial successions and that represented the most concentrated military power in Rome itself. He was ambitious, intelligent, and completely without the moral constraints that limited more conventional Roman political operators. He attached himself to Tiberius with a combination of genuine administrative competence and personal flattery that ancient sources describe as almost predatory in its calculation. Tacitus calls him a man who concealed behind a carefully modest exterior an unbounded appetite for power. Sejanus became indispensable to Tiberius gradually and then completely. He managed the administrative machinery of the empire. He controlled access to the emperor. He was the filter through which information reached Tiberius and the channel through which Tiberius's decisions reached the world. This position of structural power between the emperor and everyone else gave Sejanus opportunities for manipulation that he used with extraordinary skill. He encouraged Tiberius's suspicions about rivals and enemies, real and imagined. He positioned himself as the one loyal, trustworthy person in a court full of schemers. And then something happened that made Tiberius's withdrawal from Rome not just possible, but permanent. Tiberius's son Drusus died in 23 AD, apparently from illness. Tiberius was devastated. He had already lost his nephew Germanicus, the most popular military commander in Rome, whose death in 19 AD had produced an outpouring of public grief that dwarfed the response to any death in living memory. Now his own son was gone. The deaths hollowed something out in Tiberius that had already been significantly hollowed by decades of personal loss and political instrumentalization. In 26 AD, he left Rome for Campania and eventually settled on the island of Capri. He never returned to Rome. He governed the largest empire in the Western world from an island for the last 11 years of his reign. And in Rome, with the emperor absent, and inaccessible, Sejanus effectively became the second most powerful person alive. What Sejanus did with that power during Tiberius's absence was systematically destroy anyone who stood between him and complete control of the Roman state. He used the treason laws, legislation that made it a capital offense to harm the emperor or damage his dignity, as a weapon against political enemies, personal rivals, and anyone whose wealth he coveted or whose position threatened his own. Informers became extraordinarily valuable under this system. People who reported treasonous words or actions received a portion of the convicted person's estate, creating a financial incentive for denunciation that poisoned every relationship in Rome with suspicion. Friends denounced friends. Slaves denounced masters. Family members denounced each other. The atmosphere of terror that descended on Rome during the height of Sejanus's power was comparable to the worst periods of Caligula and Domitian. And then Tiberius moved against him. Suddenly and completely, and with a decisiveness that shocked everyone who had concluded the old emperor on his island had lost his grip on events. In 31 AD, Tiberius sent a letter to the Senate that was read aloud in a session Sejanus attended, believing he was about to receive new honors and additional powers. The letter began with praise and apparent confirmation of Sejanus' status. Then it shifted, gradually, and then completely it became an accusation. By the time the reading was finished, Sejanus was under arrest. He was executed that evening. His body was thrown on the Germanian stairs, the place where the bodies of condemned criminals were exposed, and torn apart by the Roman crowd that had feared him for years. His children were executed. Ancient sources record one of the most disturbing details in all of Roman history in connection with these executions. His daughter was too young under Roman law to be executed as a virgin, so she was first assaulted by the executioner and then strangled. Ancient sources record this with a kind of horrified disbelief even by the brutal standards of Roman political violence. His former allies and associates were arrested, tried, and executed in a wave of judicial violence that consumed much of the Roman aristocracy. Tiberius had watched and waited from his island, and when he moved with absolute finality. But the fall of Sejanus did not end the terror. If anything, it intensified it. Because now Tiberius trusted nobody. If Sejanus, the man he had trusted more than anyone for years, the man he had called the partner of his labors, had been plotting against him, then who could be trusted at all? The treason trials continued after Sejanus' fall, consuming the people who had been Sejanus' enemies as well as those who had been his allies. There was no safe position. Having supported Sejanus was evidence of complicity in his conspiracy. Having opposed him was evidence of having known about the conspiracy and failed to report it. Tacitus describes the atmosphere in Rome during this period as one of universal paralysis. Nobody spoke freely, nobody acted freely, nobody felt safe. What was Tiberius actually doing on Capri during these years? Ancient sources, particularly Suetonius, who wrote decades after the events, describe activities so depraved that historians have debated ever since whether they are literal accounts or the kind of political character assassination that Roman biographical tradition was entirely capable of producing. Suetonius describes sexual activities involving children that are so extreme that most serious historians treat them with significant skepticism, not because ancient Romans were incapable of such things, but because Suetonius had clear incentives to portray Tiberius as maximally monstrous, and because the specificity of his accounts suggests invention rather than documentation. What is more credible is the portrait of an old man who had been fundamentally damaged by decades of loss and political manipulation, retreating from a world he had never fully trusted into isolation that became increasingly absolute. He was reading. He was corresponding. He was governing. The administrative letters and decisions from this period show a mind still functioning with competence, even if the emotional and psychological deterioration was real. He was also drinking heavily, according to multiple sources, a detail that fits with the portrait of a man using whatever was available to manage an internal state that had become genuinely difficult to inhabit. He died on Capri in 37 AD at the age of 77. Ancient sources disagree about whether he died naturally or was suffocated by Caligula or Caligula's allies who were impatient for the succession. The uncertainty itself is appropriate for a reign that had made uncertainty about everything the defining condition of Roman political life. Rome's response to the news of Tiberius's death was reportedly one of the most unrestrained public celebrations the city had ever seen. People ran through the streets shouting. Crowds gathered at the Tiber, wanting to throw his body into the river. The Senate debated whether to grant him the divine honors traditionally accorded to deceased emperors and decided against it. One of the very few times a Roman emperor was denied deification. The man who had governed Rome for 23 years was mourned by essentially nobody. And yet the historical verdict on Tiberius is more complicated than that street celebration suggested. He was a genuinely capable administrator. The empire under his rule was financially sound, militarily secure, and bureaucratically functional. The treasury he left was enormous. Caligula spent it all within a year, demonstrating how much Tiberius had accumulated through careful management. The provinces were governed competently. The borders were maintained. By the objective measures of imperial administration, Tiberius did his job well. The terror, the treason, trials, the destruction of the Roman senatorial class. These were real and devastating. But they existed alongside genuine administrative competence in a combination that makes simple moral judgment difficult. What destroyed Tiberius was not stupidity or ignorance or simple cruelty. What destroyed him was something more interesting and more tragic. He was a man of genuine capability and genuine decency in some respects, who had been systematically damaged by the people and the system that used him, and who eventually became exactly what that damage had made him: isolated, suspicious, and capable of authorizing terrible things from a distance that he might not have authorized face to face. Tiberius is the emperor Rome forgot how to understand. He was not a simple monster like Caligula or a simple villain like Domitian. He was a complicated, damaged man who had been shaped by decades of loss and manipulation into someone capable of governing brilliantly and terrorizing ruthlessly simultaneously. The Senate that celebrated his death had been complicit in the treason trials that consumed it. Senators had denounced each other with enthusiasm when denunciation seemed advantageous, and had suffered the consequences of that complicity when the system they had fed turned on them. The darkness of Tiberius's reign was not simply the darkness of one man's character. It was the darkness that the imperial system Augustus had created was always capable of producing when the wrong person or the wrong circumstances occupied its center. Augustus had built a system where one man's psychology determined the fate of millions. Tiberius showed what that system looked like when the man at its center had been damaged beyond a certain point. Caligula would show what it looked like when the damage was complete from the beginning. The system had no mechanism to compensate for either. It simply absorbed the consequences and continued. He sits now in the historical record between Augustus, who built the world, and Caligula, who tried to burn it down. Too capable to be dismissed as simply evil. Too damaged to be defended as simply misunderstood. Tiberius remains what he always was: the darkest emperor Rome ever produced, and the most human one.